Hello and welcome to launch day for F1 24, and I'm going to be cutting straight to the point because I know that you want to be playing this video game at home right now as well. So in today's video, I'm going to be showing you all of my settings within the F1 24 game, from full feedback to graphical settings to camera angles and everything in between. So getting straight to the point, as I said, I know that you want to be playing the game, so I'm going to make this video as short and sweet for you at home as possible. So going straight into my full feedback settings, I'm going to be running basically identical to F1 23. And as you can going into the full feedback strength right now. Ultimately, 65%. Why? Because when you go over 70% in the full feedback for the F1 games, you start to get full feedback clipping. If you do not know what full feedback clipping is, it's where the game basically tries to put out too many details from what's happening with the curbing, from the steering rack, from the car, from the understeer, from the oversteer, and everything in between, and ultimately runs out of ability to give you the detail. So when you run underneath 70, that the wheel will always be giving you detail of what's happening with the car in every single situation. If you've ever had it while you're driving sim racing and the wheel just starts going numb in high-speed corners, that's more than likely because of full feedback clipping. So keeping it at 65, for me, is the right balance to be having good detail and also good strength from the game as well. Ultimately, on-track effect, rumble strip, off-track effect, and pit stop effects have all set down to 0, quite simply because, from what I understand about these settings, anything above 0 is in addition of and amplifying a baseline effect. So 0 is actually how the game is interpreted to feel, and ultimately, even if you have 0, you will start to feel little details on the curb as well, and anything above 0 is just over amplifying what's already a baseline effect in the game. So that being said, in my opinion, having 0 is best. And wheel damper is a lot more down to driver preference. Ultimately, I like to have it on 0, quite simply, because ultimately I like the wheel to be quite fast and snappy. Whereas if you want the wheel to be a bit more heavy and, let's say, feeling like to push it through concrete, that's how I feel it, and that's why I don't like it. This is also a good thing to have on for you, but for me, like I say, I like my wheel to be super fast, super snappy, super quick, and having it on 0 is definitely better for me. 310 on the wheel rotation, and this is simply because although the wheel and the game is quite sensitive on the front axle in this game, and it comes at a baseline of 400 degrees on the wheel rotation angle, quite simply I found that by putting it down to lower, although it makes the front incredibly sensitive, 1, it's faster, 2, ultimately, by having it even more sensitive, it starts to push it through a threshold, and then it becomes so sensitive that you can actually do micro corrections within very small inputs in real life. If you start to put this wheel rotation angle up super high, ultimately what ends up happening is you have to do the same corrections in the game anyway, but you have to travel your hands quite far, and it can cost you quite a lot of lap time trying to get to the correct steering angle to correct a slide. So having it at 310 for me is the ideal compromise between having a front end that I can feel confident and I can control, but also having the ability to catch the oversteer and the slides ASAP. For the calibration angles and details here, I have everything set to 0. The baseline value within the game, at least when I loaded it, was 25% with the brake linearity setting. And ultimately, for me, I like to have it on 0 because I like to have everything as a 1-to-1 feeling from what's happening with my body, with my feet, with my hands, to also what's happening in the game. When I start to load up more and more brake linearity setting, effectively what this is doing is making the first half of the brake travel less sensitive and making the second half of the brake travel more sensitive. So if I put on 50% here and ultimately put my pedal to 50% braking force in game, around 50, 48, I'm going to hold the force as consistently as I can. Ultimately, then I'm going to go out of here and then go back into the brake linearity, put it down to 0, load up the same menu. You can see it's at 62. So putting 50% in the brake linearity can bring upwards of a 20% braking force difference, was actually, let's say, put into the game, was actually going through the car physics model. So ultimately, this can be good if you're on a non-load cell pedal, but while I'm on a load cell pedal, I like to have my feeling and my foot be 1-to-1 with whatever's happening. So I know that when I reach the end of the pedal travel, it's at 100%, and when I do the small inputs, you can see I can control 1, 2, 3% really easily, and it's something that my brain is very in tune with. Ultimately, yeah, so everything on 0 there, and going down, this is what I use on the Fanatec wheel, so if it could be helpful to you, a reference to you, feel free to use my settings here as well. Ultimately, something that is quite cool to note though, and something that could be quite handy for you, if you do have spare buttons on your wheel, on the Fanatec we have the rotary buttons, basically just in front of the shifters, and a really good placement for the thumbs. Basically, I can put this to my brake bias and my differential setting, so when I'm driving around in the game, as I show you right now on the bottom right hand side of the screen, you can see I can change everything really quickly, and I'm able to go in between the settings as fast as I like, and this can become very useful while going in between apexes and allowing me to be at peak performance ASAP. Going back into the settings menu, assists, of course, all are turned off, but I think this is pretty normal anyway. With my camera settings as well, view next, I have this with the T-Cam offset, quite simply because I found that the higher that you go, there's a new feature in this new F1 24 game that what basically amplifies the roll of the car and shows it with a visual effect of the camera. When I go higher and higher and higher on the camera, effectively I feel like the camera rolls more and can become quite distracting. And ultimately, it's maybe not that obvious from the video, but when driving myself, you can see that the camera is shaking around really a lot when I put it up to its maximum height. And now if I go back down to my original setting with 0, how it's actually stock from the game and how the physics model was basically based around this setting. I need to go to my camera angle. That was my control settings. There we go, perfect. So if I go back down to 0, where the game was intended and basically coded from as a baseline value, I'm going to do the same inputs. Oh, big oversteer. And I don't know how obvious it is from the video, but definitely while driving and having my eyes in real life, the camera definitely shakes around less and is a bit more controllable, at least in my opinion. So you can also take this theory further and basically put the camera settings all the way down to 0 on the vertical, and this would make the setting even more extreme. But for me, there's diminishing returns and ultimately is a bit more negative, and having better track sight with the vertical set to 0 compared to -20 is more beneficial for me anyway. So that being said, this is my offset T-Cam settings. Feel free to copy them. Critical thing to note is camera shakers on 0. Something I was also playing around with quite a lot was cockpit camera, as this year's cockpit camera is actually quite good due to the fact that you have also the camera roll, what does not have an effect in cockpit camera, so it can actually become much more useful to me anyway, and the cockpit camera is much more powerful this year, as quite simply the camera is not rolling around here and you can actually be quite more precise. And probably this is the most I've enjoyed cockpit camera on any Formula 1 game due to the camera roll in offset T-Cam. But of course, my preferred camera is offset T-Cam, as we get a big snap of oversteer here and just running almost off the track. But ultimately, going back into the settings. Next up is going to be my audio settings, and you can see I run 10, 10, 0, because the music in the menu is just not my thing, to be honest. Other cars at 10, and offset my offboard mix, basically onboard mix I should say, is ultimately set to cinematic. I found this was actually the best detail and the best feeling for the audio of the car, and ultimately allowed me to be hearing the car notes and of course the wheel spin a lot better anyway. Ultimately, my audio performance is ultra high, and lead commentator is Alex Jakes because he did a go-to job at Monaco GP with Charles Leclerc winning, so chef kiss, he deserved that. Ultimately as well, I have my formation parking lap sensor to on and my upshift tone off because it's just a bit annoying, to be honest. And then yeah, you can see here, this is just radio verbosity down to critical. I often have this on responses only or critical depending on the day, depending on the situation, but I like my engineer in-game to be speaking as little as possible, as it could be quite annoying when you're coming around a qualifying lap and you get told that you have 2 laps of fuel left, and it's quite unnecessary in my opinion. So Next up is going to be my graphical settings. I have my motion blur down to 0, quite simply just to be a bit more consistent and ultimately to have better feeling with the game as well. And you can see I run these settings as well. I'm not going to read them all out just to keep the video a bit shorter, a bit sweeter, but you can take a screenshot of them as well. Ultimately, there's actually a really critical thing in this game, and using the 59 FPS is faster. Again, ultimately it's to do with the physics model of the game that on the PlayStation and Xbox that they have to compensate for. At least this is my understanding of it. When they have to compensate and make the physics model for the Xbox and the PlayStation, well, of course, can't go up to like 200 frames per second, 300 like we can on PC. They build basically the ability for the game to be able to run on those platforms, and this is why that when you go underneath the 56 frames per second, that it's faster on the PC platform, as then it's matching the console's physics model as well. At least this is my understanding of it. And yeah, ultimately the game is more enjoyable on PC when you have it above 120 frames per second, as the physics model is running how it's intended to be. But ultimately, yeah, if you want to go faster, at least my understanding right now, put it on 59 FPS and that will help. But ultimately I want to enjoy the game as well, so I have it off at the moment. My graphical settings are all set to ultra low, apart from my NVIDIA Reflex is set to on, as this basically helps you with latency and makes the input lag even lower. The reason I have this to ultra low and not ultra high is quite simply when I found having an ultra low, the response to the game is just fractionally better, and it's basically not distracting me from having unnecessary lights or unnecessary details, and allows me just to focus on the driving as much as possible without the distraction of having like the ray tracing show up a light from, you can see like above us in Bahrain right now, you can see the car is not having lights bouncing off it, and just makes me a bit better to focus on the job that I'm doing and not to be distracted by some random light popping up out of nowhere. Again, like I say, the higher FPS as well is just nicer to play with. The game is a bit smoother and ultimately allows for less distractions. I'm also going to touch upon my Fanatec settings here as well. So if you're using a Fanatec product within the F124 game, almost said F123. If you're using a Fanatec product within the F124 game, this is the settings that I found works really good for me and ultimately gives me good feeling within the game as well. So this is my tuning menu. I run 310 degrees on the rotation, of course, and I run 73% on the full seatback, quite simply, as recently I learned when you go over 15%, it's only to do with peak torque, and if you want to have a constant level of full seatback and have a better, let's say, overall experience, running underneath 15 Newton meters on the DD1 wheel will be giving you a better feeling. I have the natural damper, natural friction, natural inertia turned off, and ultimately going back to the setting menu so you can see everything and take a screenshot as well. Wheel vibration motor is turned off, as quite simply it's just a bit unnecessary for driving and performance. And my brake force is set to 65 as I'm using the Fanatec V2 pedals, and ultimately, yeah, just to keep a bit more consistency in the pedal and to help the shelf life of the pedal as well. So going back into the game for the final setting, that's going to be my on-screen display. You can see I have my track map to full on the bottom left, and I have everything turned on apart from the rear view mirror, as quite simply I find it a bit annoying, and ultimately I can be looking behind me with my button anyway, and having just the rear view mirror I think is just a bit of a distraction for me while driving. But the final thing to touch upon is going to be my on-screen display, and as you see at the top left of the screen when I'm driving, I have it slightly different compared to default setting, and I'm going to show you why. So I just need to bring up my race layout, and as you can see at the top left, ultimately I have my what's the wording, like the timing tower and the lap counter that have been moved up slightly, as it's quite simply when I'm driving around, and to show you a pure example of it right now, it can block the view of the apexes, so just going to be turning this off, and yeah, you can see at the top left, because they have been moved up and into the corner of the screen, I'm not having any of the track blocked by the timing tower or the lap counter as well, and it's allowing me full view and a full coverage of what's happening with the road and happening with the track as well, allowing me just to have a bit better confidence while driving around in circles. So with that being said, of course it's launch day, hopefully you're enjoying the game, hopefully these settings help you, and I will be doing a lot of streaming, a lot of videos, and basically uploading daily from this point onwards, covering F1 with tutorials, career mode, hot laps, guides, setups, everything you can name. I will be doing it because I want to really focus this season and focus this year a lot on good content, and to really be pushing some really good content out for you as well. So be sure to head over to my streaming pages where I'll be live on the Kick, on the Twitch, everything in between, and yeah. So see you over there, and catch you later. Ciao, ciao, bye bye.